The air is heavy, a suffocating mixture of incense, burning myrrh, and something else faint but unmistakable: fear. The only light comes from the dying sun filtering through layers of thick silk curtains, painting the chamber in a sickly amber glow. We are not in the public magnificence of Susa or Persepolis, but deep within the king's private fortress, the royal harem, the hidden world of the King of Kings. Inside, the servants move in silence. Their fingers glide over the smooth skin of a young girl, rubbing her with perfumed oil. Their hands tremble, though not from cold. The girl they prepare is barely more than a child. Her collarbones rise sharply beneath the translucent veil. Her breath quivers. She doesn't know whether she's the 100th or the 1000th. Numbers mean nothing here. In this endless labyrinth of locked chambers and forbidden corridors, only one truth remains. The man waiting in the next room is not only the ruler of millions from India to Greece, not only the living embodiment of Ahura Mazda, he is her father. On the surface, the Persian Empire appears as the wonder of the ancient world, vast, orderly, radiant with gold and authority. Xerxes I, the son of Darius the Great, commands unimaginable power. His word is law, his gaze is destiny. He is the King of Kings, ruler of rulers, master of life and death. Yet when power becomes absolute, it ceases to rule nations alone. It begins to consume the soul. Absolute power demands ever greater transgression to feel alive. Behind the gleaming facades of palaces and temples, behind walls plated with gold and guarded by eunuchs, the divine king's heart has begun to rot. This is not a tale of glorious battles or imperial triumphs. It is the story of a prison disguised in silk and a crime buried beneath the polished marble of history. The Persian royal harem was never a mere den of pleasure. It was a political institution, a world within a world, governed by its own secret laws. When Xerxes inherited his father's empire, he inherited not only territory, but the entire machinery of this system, a structure designed to control, manipulate, and contain women as instruments of state and symbols of submission. Hidden in the depths of the palace, the harem formed a labyrinth no outsider could enter. Its walls were built to conceal, its passages designed for silence. Within lived hundreds of women, a living mosaic of Persia's conquests. There were princesses from defeated kingdoms, sent as guarantees of peace. There were daughters of Persian nobles, offered as tributes to secure their families' loyalty. There were dancers and musicians, captured beauties from Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, and India, all serving the same unending sentence. Each woman occupied a precise rung in a hierarchy as complex as the empire itself. They were not wives, not citizens, not free beings. They were imperial property, living symbols of conquered nations and domesticated power. To rule them was to rule the world. The keepers of this golden cage were the eunuchs. Castrated young, stripped of family and desire, they were the king's most loyal servants. They managed the harem with ruthless precision, the food, the jewels, the schedules, and above all the information. They were the eyes and ears of the throne, and often its knives. Their loyalty was absolute because they had no bloodline to serve but the king's. Every woman brought into the harem underwent a ritual transformation. They were trained in the arts of pleasure and grace, music, poetry, dance, and conversation. A few might rise to favour through wit or intimacy, whispering counsel into the king's ear, but the game was deadly. One word could elevate a concubine to queen. One wrong glance could end her life before sunrise. It was the perfect mechanism of control, a cage so exquisite that its prisoners might forget they were enslaved. Yet within this perfumed prison, a new and unimaginable tragedy began to unfold. Some of these women bore daughters, and when a child was born behind the silken walls of the harem, her fate was decided from the moment she cried. The daughters of Xerxes, born of concubines, grew up in the same labyrinth that had devoured their mothers. They were royal by blood, yet nameless. They were not trained for marriage or diplomacy like the daughters of official wives. They were neither princesses nor servants. They existed in a void, a haunting grey zone of possession. For these children, the harem was not just home, it was their entire universe. They learned to walk on marble floors, to speak in whispers, to read faces instead of words. They saw their mothers waiting endlessly for the king's summons, They breathed the same heavy air of rivalry, jealousy, and submission. From the beginning, they were taught obedience, modesty, and silence. Above all, they learned the central law of their existence. Their bodies did not belong to them. Their bodies belonged to the empire, and the empire was the king. Outside these sealed corridors, Xerxes himself was changing. His grand ambitions had collapsed. The crushing defeats in Greece, the humiliation at Salamis and Plataea, shattered his image of divine invincibility. The conqueror who once commanded 1,000,000 men now turned inward, retreating into the only realm where his will remained absolute, the Harem. Here, within this secret kingdom of silk and shadow, he could still play God, and it was here that his divinity curdled into madness. When a man can have anything, desire itself dies. Surrounded by endless beauty, beauty loses meaning. When all submit, submission ceases to thrill. Absolute power grows bored with the ordinary. It begins to crave the forbidden. And in Xerxes, the hunger for transgression became his only remaining appetite. Greek chroniclers such as Herodotus whispered of early signs. They told of the king's obsession with the wife of his own brother, Mercistes. The machinery of obedience made sure every horror could occur unseen, unquestioned, unrecorded. Fragments from later writers, among them Ctesias, the Greek physician who served at the Persian court, hint at the unspeakable. Though his works survive only in pieces, he described a palace consumed by moral decay, where taboos were broken not by accident but by design. In his writings, the harem appears not as a household but as a factory of corruption, a mechanism that transformed human souls into instruments of pleasure and fear. For the young princesses there was no resistance. How could they refuse the man who was their father, their king, and their god? They had been trained since birth to obey. They were prisoners bred in captivity, created for the pleasure of their captor. The system did not just permit their violation, it required it. The eunuchs became its facilitators. Xerxes, who believed himself divine, completes the circle of his delusion. He becomes both the giver of life and its destroyer. In this act of horror, he proves that his power has no limits. For the Greeks, these tales became symbols of Eastern decadence, exaggerated whispers of barbaric luxury. Yet beneath the bias lies a trace of truth. Deserters, spies, and fallen nobles carried fragments of this story across the Aegean. They spoke of a king consumed by his own authority, a god whose throne had become his coffin. Even in the moral universe of antiquity, where pharaohs married sisters and princes wed cousins, the union of father and daughter was an abomination. The Persians had a word, zweduda, for endogamous marriage, but even that law had limits. To violate the boundary between creator and child was the final heresy, and perhaps that is why Xerxes did it. To him, crossing that line was the ultimate act of dominion, proof that he stood above every human and divine law. For a man who ruled the known world, it was the last forbidden thing left to conquer. Outside the golden walls of Persepolis, the empire that had once stretched from the Indus to the Aegean was beginning to crumble. But within the palace, where reality was scented with myrrh and shadowed by fear, the collapse had already happened. The King of Kings no longer ruled an empire of men. He ruled only over ghosts, over the broken women and silent daughters trapped in the silken labyrinth of his own making. Xerxes had once commanded the largest army ever assembled by man. He had bridged seas, burned cities, and demanded that oceans bow before his will. But now his world had shrunk to the walls of his harem. The divine conqueror who once chained the Hellespont for defying him now found his pleasure in chaining his own blood. When a man's will becomes law, and law becomes worship, there is no boundary left to cross, and so the god-king, who believed himself immortal, began to rot alive in the velvet shadows of his own throne. The palace no longer echoed with the disciplined rhythm of empire. It pulsed with whispers, dangerous, frightened, and hungry. The eunuchs, once instruments of perfect order, had become conspirators in silence. They knew too much. They had seen too much. Every breath inside the royal compound carried the taste of fear. Servants vanished. Women disappeared. New faces arrived without names. No one asked questions, because in the kingdom of Xerxes, knowledge itself was treason. Yet even the most intricate system of control eventually devours itself. The machinery of secrecy that had once hidden the king's sins now began to hide the sins of his servants. The same eunuchs who delivered trembling girls to the royal chamber began to trade information, to plot, to whisper in corners. The silence of the harem was perfect, but perfection cannot last when terror becomes routine. In the years after his defeat in Greece, Xerxes withdrew further into isolation. He ceased to hold audiences. The empire's governors, the satraps, ruled unchecked, squeezing their provinces dry with taxes and cruelty. The army, once the pride of Persia, lost its discipline. Corruption bled through the court like a poison. While the outer empire decayed, the inner empire, the harem, had become its dark reflection. A small, glittering version of the whole, devoured from within by the same disease of absolute power. The Greek physician Ctesias, who served in the Persian court, later described a king consumed by paranoia and superstition. Xerxes surrounded himself with omens and magicians, fearing that even his dreams were conspiracies. His divinity had become a prison. He could no longer sleep without guards standing beside him, yet he trusted no one, not even them. The god who demanded silence now trembled at every whisper. And still, the rituals continued. Each night the same perfumes were burned, the same songs played, the same girls prepared and presented. The acts of depravity were no longer about pleasure. They were about control, the endless need to prove that his power was still real. To dominate his own blood was to declare himself beyond mortality. But gods do not bleed. Men do. It is said that one of his daughters, unnamed in all surviving records, took her own life. She was found at dawn, her body wrapped in the silks that had once marked her as royal. The eunuchs buried her quietly in the gardens, under the shadow of the cedar doors. The king never spoke of her again. Yet after that night, he grew more violent, more desperate. Every death was met with another command, another execution, another desperate act of excess. The palace, once a monument to order, now lived in constant fear of the king's moods. A gesture, a silence, even a breath could be fatal. The marble floors that once reflected sunlight now bore dark stains that no servant dared to scrub too hard. Among those closest to Xerxes was a man named Artabanus, captain of the royal guard. To him belonged the impossible duty of protecting the king's life, even from the king himself. For years he had watched the empire unravel from behind its golden screens. He had watched the king's madness grow, watched men disappear, and women dragged away to fates unspoken. Perhaps he pitied Xerxes, perhaps he despised him, or perhaps, like everyone else in the palace, he simply grew tired of living in fear. One name echoes through the Persian chronicles: Aspameter, a eunuch of high rank, one of those who managed the harem. He had been both accomplice and witness to the king's darkest acts. He knew every secret passage, every hidden door. He also knew that the tide of power was shifting. In the end, even gods need servants. And when servants turn, gods fall. The night of Xerxes' death was silent, as all nights in the harem were. The air was heavy with jasmine and oil. The guards had been dismissed early, their loyalty long eroded by bribes and fatigue. Artabanus entered the royal chambers with quiet steps. Behind him, Aspameter held a small lamp. They moved like shadows between walls that had seen too much. The king lay half asleep on a bed of gold-threaded linen. For a moment, perhaps he thought the figure standing above him was another servant come to deliver the night's offering. He opened his mouth to speak, and then the dagger struck. The first blow was clean, the second desperate. Xerxes, the king of kings, son of Darius, scourge of Greece, ruler of nations, died not in battle, not under the gaze of gods or men, but in the dark silence of his own palace, beneath the hand of his most trusted guard. The god who believed himself eternal died as all tyrants do, suddenly, quietly, and alone. The silence that followed was not relief but confusion. The walls that had been trained to keep secrets did not know what to do when the centre of all fear was gone. Some say the eunuchs screamed, some say they simply continued their duties as if nothing had happened. The machinery of obedience does not stop easily. Outside, in the rest of the empire, dawn came as usual. But inside the golden fortress, chaos erupted. Factions formed within hours. Artabanus, the murderer of a god, now had to decide who would wear the crown. He turned first to Xerxes' sons. One of them, Darius, was accused of plotting the assassination. Another, Artaxerxes, claimed divine vengeance. Within days, the palace became a battlefield of whispers and blood. Artabanus was executed, his body dragged through the corridors he had once guarded. Aspamitras, the eunuch, met a slower fate. According to Greek sources, he was flayed alive, the punishment reserved for those who betrayed the sacred flesh of kings. And what of the women of the harem? When the god died, their world did not end. It simply shifted ownership. The palace chroniclers record no liberation, no freedom, no voice. They were transferred, catalogued, and absorbed into the new reign as if nothing had changed. The golden prison remained. Only the face of the warden was different. For those nameless daughters, the death of their father brought no justice. There were no songs, no tombs, no memories written in stone. History, written by men, chose not to remember them. They became whispers buried beneath the ruins of Persepolis, shadows without names, victims without graves. Xerxes left behind no stronger empire, no lasting peace. He left behind an exhausted people, corrupt officials, and a legacy of fear. Within a century, Alexander the Great would burn Persepolis to the ground, and the smoke would rise from the very halls where the daughters of Xerxes once wept. The marble pillars would crumble, but the sickness of power would live on, reborn in every throne that mistook divinity for dominion. The tragedy of Xerxes is not only the story of a single man's fall, it is the anatomy of power itself, how systems built on silence and obedience eventually consume their creators. The harem was not an accident of luxury. It was the mirror of the empire, beautiful, efficient, and utterly inhuman. Every chamber, every servant, every law existed to preserve one man's illusion of godhood, and in preserving it, the system became complicit in his crimes. When we read the names of kings, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Alexander, we see empires rising and falling like tides, but history rarely speaks of those who lived and died in the shadows of their power. The nameless daughters of the harem do not appear in chronicles or poems. Their stories were erased not by time, but by design. Yet the silence they left behind is louder than any monument. It warns us that tyranny begins not with cruelty, but with obedience, with the moment a man believes himself above the limits of others. Xerxes' empire fell, not because his enemies were strong, but because his own walls hid too many secrets. The disease of power spread from the harem to the court, from the court to the provinces, until the entire empire was hollow. In the end, the lesson of Xerxes is timeless. No matter the century, no matter the throne, absolute power always builds its own harem, a place where truth is silenced, humanity is denied, and control masquerades as divinity. The palaces of gold may fall to dust, but these invisible harems still rise around us, in politics, in wealth, in the unchecked hands of those who believe themselves untouchable. The story of Xerxes is not ancient, it is eternal. History remembers his name. But the ghosts within his walls, the daughters, the mothers, the silent witnesses, are the true measure of his reign. Their voices may be lost, but their suffering remains written in the architecture of every empire that follows. Because the real curse of Xerxes was never his death. It was the system that survived him.